If you see something that needs to get done, if you see work that needs to happen, we don't have to wait for some institution or some other person or some political leader to do the work. We can just sort of roll up our sleeves and do it.
Welcome to the follow-up question. I'm your host, Michael Ashford. Come with me on a journey as I explore what it means to find common ground at a time when it feels increasingly harder to do so, to listen more than we speak so that we can understand that our differences don't have to divide us. My aim with this show is to bring you perspectives and ways of looking at issues or topics that perhaps you haven't considered before, so that you can then take that new knowledge and apply it to your ability to empathize with the people around you. I'm a former journalist who believes everyone has a story to tell, and it's only when we ask questions and listen that we truly reveal what connects us as humans. Our dreams, our desires, our experiences, our ideas, and who we truly are. When you hear the word peace, what comes to mind? Do you think about beauty pageants and cliche answers about world peace? Do you think about leaders of countries sitting down in front of cameras to negotiate peace treaties? Do you think about being on a secluded beach or beside a mountain stream and hearing only the sounds of nature? For this week's guest, John Noltner, the meaning of peace has come out of some pretty uncomfortable moments. You see, John's a former newspaper guy, much like me, and for years, he worked as a photographer, traveling the world to take photos for some of the most respected publications out there. And then the 2008 recession happened. John was left with too few assignments to keep the bills paid, so he had to come up with a plan. But here's the thing. John was not only feeling the financial pressure of his situation, but there was a greater tug at his heart. He was increasingly concerned about how often we rush into and then brush aside conflict. To John, peace looked like sitting down, face to face, across from someone with a different story to tell, and simply asking them questions about their life, their beliefs, their perspectives, and their experiences. And I hope by now you can see why John had to be a guest on this show. So, John began a project that came to be called A Piece of My Mind, where he traveled the country gathering stories and portraits of people with a story and a perspective that needed to be shared and heard. He details all of these stories and adventures in his new book, Portraits of Peace, Searching for Hope in a Divided America. And in our conversation, John and I talk about all that he has learned along the way. John shares a checklist of sorts as to how we get better at exploring uncomfortable topics with each other, including what I feel to be the most important step: we must continue to show up. The more we remove ourselves from the discomfort of having difficult conversations, the more we withdraw to our tribes and echo chambers, the more we push out a chance for peace, and the more the smoldering coals of division risk becoming an all-consuming inferno of hate. At the expense of being a little bit corny and perhaps cheesy, I'm going to ask you what I read that you ask all of your interview subjects, which is, if I didn't know anything about you, what would you want me to know?
Yeah, interesting. It's always fun to sit on this side of an interview. I would want you to know that I'm a father. I am a husband. I am a Christmas tree farmer. I am an artist, and I love storytelling. Anything beyond that is gravy, and we can get into that. But those are the things that define me.
Okay, Christmas tree farmer was not in the book.
That's an outlier, isn't it? Sorry about that.
No, that's great. I love that. That's exactly what I assume you asked that question for, was to get to the unintended answers. John, you mentioned you are a father and a husband, and your work through A Piece of My Mind spurned out of the need to provide for your family, as I read in the book. Can you just kind of describe how this project got started, where you were at mentally, financially, just to level set for the audience?
Yeah, of course. I have made my career as a freelance photographer for most of my life and have shot for national magazines and Fortune 500 companies. And we had a really good business going, and it was great. And I loved it. I was shooting travel projects across the United States and around the world. And, I might be on a traditional schooner sailing one week and in a spa in downtown Chicago the next. And it was great until it wasn't. And the recession of 2008, 2009 really impacted my bottom line. It really reduced my workload quickly and dramatically. And, about that same time, I had been getting increasingly frustrated with the quality of our national dialogue and all the things that can ask us to look at what can separate us. And I wondered if there was something I could do with my photography and storytelling instead to remember what connects us. And you referenced the bottom line, but when this project started, the bottom line had nothing to do with it. I could have gone to McDonald's and flipped burgers and made more money than I was making with A Piece of My Mind. But instead of feeding my belly, this project was feeding my soul. And it was only over years and almost a whole decade before we sort of figured out how the project could have legs and it could become self-sustaining.
The concern over the national dialogue, what was it that you were thinking about, that you were experiencing, that took you in the direction of, I'm actually going to do something about it, versus just how I think most of us are? We just sit back and we're like, frustrated, throw our hands up. Why did you actually commit to a project like this to do something about it?
Yeah, my dad was a social worker and my mom was an educator. And so I think, and we didn't talk about these things overtly, but I think in the back of my mind, always this notion of the common good came to the forefront, and this notion that if you see something that needs to be fixed, well, you should get to work and you should start fixing it. I don't think I even talk about this in the book, but there was a time Hurricane Mitch went through Central America and really devastated it. And I'm bad at dates. What was that?
I remember Hurricane Mitch. I could not tell you the date. Yeah.
Yeah. Late 90s, early 2000s, something like that. And I had recently been in Honduras for an assignment, and I went to my pastor and I said, man, I've always wanted to be part of a church that could respond globally, whether it's education or health or microfinance, whatever it is. I want to be part of a community that can look beyond its own walls and sort of consider the larger world. And Rick, my pastor, listened patiently, and then he said, well, that's a great idea, John. Why don't you go ahead and do that? And I'll support you any way that I can. And it was, that was not the answer that I expected him to give me. But what it told me is exactly what I just said. If you see something that needs to get done, if you see work that needs to happen, we don't have to wait for some institution or some other person or some political leader to do the work. We can just sort of roll up our sleeves and do it. And so Rick, I think, did exactly what he intended to with that lesson, which was empower me to and sensitize me to the notion that if some work needs to happen, well, maybe that's my work.
Why peace? Why specifically peace?
Yeah, I could answer that in a couple ways, Michael. First is that I don't know. I'm probably a hippie born a little bit too late. I have an interest in social justice. I have a desire to do some of this work, maybe push some expectations a little bit and consider new ways of seeing things. I think all of us would welcome a little bit more peace in our lives, whether that's our our family circle or our neighborhood or the bigger world, but we're not very good at getting it. We're not very good at making it. And so very often there's this disconnect between what we say we value and how we live our day-to-day lives. And that notion was both disturbing and fascinating to me, sort of as a sociological experiment. So that was sort of my notion going into it. Peace, how do we live better together? But what I found as I went down the path of this project is that this simple or not so simple question also opened a door to all sorts of other interesting conversations around race and gender and faith and international policy, national priorities, really anything that was close to people's heart. This was an open invitation to explore those things.
When you were doing your freelance work as a photographer, was any of this filtering out in the atmosphere around you? Were you having these kinds of ideas or thoughts as you were traveling to all these places?
I think so, but not maybe in this coherent fashion, maybe not articulated this same sort of way, but intuitively, what I found is that I was engaging with all sorts of people. I was engaging with families whose children were in pediatric intensive care units. I was dealing with AIDS patients. I was dealing with people in the prison system and motorcycle gangs and artists and CEOs. And everywhere I went, I was seeing beauty and wisdom. I was seeing rich humanity that amazed and inspired me. And it didn't matter who the people were. In fact, maybe it was more likely that it was going to come from some fella who was homeless and on the streets than it was going to come from some CEO in a tie in a boardroom. So I started seeing this beauty and wisdom that was all around us. And it hurt my heart when I saw all this division that was pushing for something less constructive.
Were you all personally affected by that type of division that you were seeing?
I think so. I think I was being eaten up by the news cycle. All of the animosity in the news cycle, 24/7 news. You're a journalist, like I'm a journalist. Earlier in my career, there's a lot of great journalism that happens, but there is a lot of really bad habits that have developed in a 24/7 news cycle. And so I was being eaten up by that. So it's interesting. And I write about this in the new book. In Sedona, Arizona, I was photographing a travel story on Sedona. And part of that travel story was to photograph a spiritual journey, which my wife was the one on the spiritual journey. Rahilio was the one leading it, and I was the one photographing it. But during that process, Rahilio said some words that I probably have heard before, but at that moment it resonated. And he said, "Don't work against what you hate, but work for what you love." And that's, I don't know, that's probably a bumper sticker somewhere, but it's a sea change with how you approach the world. And so instead of continuing to invest my energy in being upset with the news cycle and the political polarization, instead, I started presenting an alternative in stories of compassion, stories of hope and healing, and trying to amplify those and use them as our model for how we can move forward better together.
I read in the book, as you were initially getting going, you relied heavily on your network, and still do, obviously, to set up the interviews that you did and produce the portraits. How did you describe the work that you were doing? And how was it received in the early days as you were just trying to form this thing out of nothing?
Yeah, it's interesting. I could answer that in a number of ways. One of the lessons I learned was that language is important, because as I would call someone maybe out of the blue and say, "Hey, is Janice there?" And they would say, "Well, can I tell her who's calling?" And I would say, "Yeah, tell her it's John with a piece of my mind." And,
I remember
and you
this.
could, yeah, you could hear sort of the muffled laughter in the background saying, "Oh, Janet, I think you're in trouble." And so, that created a stumbling block, and we could overcome it and we could laugh about it, but it became an obstacle that we had to deal with. So I had to learn in the process, don't say that. Say, "Hey, tell her it's John with a project called A Piece of My Mind." And so I think that just that in a microcosm is a lesson about how we communicate in life, how words are important, and how setting the tone for a conversation can really guide the path that an encounter is going to take. So I learned over time language that connected, language that opened doors and possibilities. And I learned to understand for myself what exactly it was I was trying to do. I think at first, and this is the way I operate, a little bit intuitively in the world. And sometimes these ideas swirl around in my head, but they never really take form until I have to say them out loud. And I've heard that from a lot of my subjects as well. Ideas like, boy, I never really had to articulate this, or I sort of surprised myself when I had to say it out loud, or I started understanding myself even better when you were asking me clarifying questions. And so I think both on an interview by interview basis, but also on a structural basis, I have learned to understand my mission and role in the world a little bit better through this process.
One of my favorite things, John, about interviewing people is that moment that you just said, when you ask the clarifying question, the follow-up question, and you can see the wheels kind of turning in someone's head as they begin to try to articulate something, an answer to something that they've never asked before. What is that moment like for you, having gone through so many of these poignant interviews and situations? What is that moment like for you when you ask the question and you can see they've never had to answer this before?
Yeah, I mean, it's goosebumps, really. I mean, it's just I'm on the edge of my seat to see what comes out of their mouth. And it's weird because I've done this enough now to be comfortable with the process. At first, I was really consumed with the process, and that makes it harder to focus on the moment. But now, like, as you see those wheels turning, I'm on the edge of my seat because I'm like, oh, this is it. Here comes the big thing. And I think also in that process, I've realized to just be patient and to just be quiet and let people talk. I just did an interview with a man who was experiencing homelessness. He had been for some time, and he spoke really slowly. And I would think that he was done, and he would pause, and I would be just about to say something again, and he would keep going. And it's those moments that the biggest gems were. And so I had to learn again to be patient and to wait, for people to get where they needed to get.
Did you ever come up against? Oh, let me rephrase and start again. People are notorious for not wanting their picture taken. I would think you would agree.
Yeah, for sure.
How do you overcome that when you layer on top of it the fact that you're talking about some pretty vulnerable subjects with people? You're talking about their homelessness. You're talking about their sexual identity, their politics. You talked. There were several stories in the book about Native Americans and Native American culture and just the wrongs that they have experienced. You're talking about race, all of these things that humanize us in such incredible ways, and then to lead into a photo. What is that process like?
Well, you said a key thing in your question, which is then to lead into a photo. The photo doesn't come first. I used to consider myself a photographer who could write, as opposed to a writer who took pictures. I'm not sure that's still the case. Actually, now I just call myself a storyteller, and sometimes those stories take the form of words, and sometimes they take the form of photographs. But always, 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 the interview comes first, so that we have time to get comfortable with one another, so that they can hear in the exchange that I honor and respect them and their story, so that we can get comfortable with one another's presence. Also, it gives me the chance to sort of watch how they hold themselves. Are there comfortable positions that they return to? When I interviewed Joanne Bland, and so she marched with Dr. King from Selma to Montgomery when she was 11 years old. I interviewed her in her home 12 days after Michael Brown was shot in Ferguson, Missouri. So there was a very real and raw emotion in that room, in that space, during that conversation. And every time Joanne paused at a poignant moment, she sort of looked down and to the side. And even as I was interviewing her, I could see in my mind's eye, I'm like, I think that's how I want to photograph Joanne. And so we set that tone, and we set that stage of being in community and in conversation. And it's only after that hour or more that we've been together that I even bring out a camera. And when I do, I also try to give the person some agency. And I say, well, what do you have in mind? Is there a setting? Is there a place? Is there something that makes sense for you, so that they feel invested in it? So a photo is not something that happens to them, it happens with them. And I think that's a part of making people comfortable.
What does it mean to ask gently?
Yeah, there's a passage I wrote in the book that so often we forget to do the groundwork and build the foundation for having these difficult conversations. And so instead we jump right into the fire, and we're surprised when we get burned. Can I
read you that? Because that's actually one of the highlights that I wrote down in my notes. I just want to read that so everybody can hear it, because it was fantastic.
Oh, yeah, please.
I've learned that we can find ways to have productive conversations around even the most contentious subjects, but you have to earn that opportunity. You have to invest time in building a foundation of trust before wading into difficult issues. And that's the part we tend to skip over in the public realm. We tend to lead with the thorniest problems. We frame them as an attack, a challenge, or a judgment, and the rhetoric heats up quickly. We step right into the fire, and we are surprised when we get burned.
Yeah, that's so much better than what I was just going to say out loud. Because again, this is an idea that I've played with for a long time, but there are very few things that I've found we can't talk about. There are very few instances that people in fact, I'm going to say never. Nobody has ever said to me, I don't want to talk about that. Move on. We have always entered into conversation, and that's not because I am pushing somebody into it. It's because I'm inviting somebody into it. And I think that process of asking gently lets people understand, hey, I know that we're walking into difficult space here. And I'm not even sure if I'm going to ask this question well, but let me frame it like this. And so, I guess asking gently comes with humility. It comes with vulnerability, and it comes with a sense of compassion for who's on the other end. So it's framed as human curiosity. It's framed as an invitation, not as any sort of demand or accusation or any of those things that are so prevalent in our world today.
When you contrast that then, John, with the demand, with the where does the audacity to demand answers from someone that we don't know. Where does that come from? In your experience and all the conversations you've had, where do you see that demand coming from?
Boy, I'm not sure I've been asked that question before. I think the demand comes from a focus on self. I think the demand comes from a need to be right. I think the demand, if I follow that train of logic, I think the demand comes from no, I have to be careful. I think the demand comes from an uncertainty or an uncomfortableness where we're trying to protect and define and control a scenario that maybe we can't. Of course, that's not universally true, but I think that there may be some of that in the mix.
You write that the counter to that is building trust in these situations. And you're certainly not going into these conversations and these interviews antagonistically, but how do you build trust? And what can we take away from how you build trust around these difficult topics that you're asking people about to take it into the broader conversation? How do we build trust?
Yeah, we invest the time. We earnestly and honestly invest the time. This happened after this book was published. I'm sure this story is going to make it into whatever the next book is. But when George Floyd was killed in Minneapolis, that was 11.6 miles north of my house in Bloomington, Minnesota. And like everybody, I was happy to be at home quarantining in the pandemic. I had not been really out in the public realm, but I knew if a piece of my mind was going to do what it set out to do, if it was going to be able to bridge divides and build community, if it was going to endeavor to be a better ally, as my middle-aged white guy self, I couldn't sit home in the suburbs and not go there. So I brought the first day I just went to sort of be present and bear witness and try to understand what was going on at that intersection, 38th and Chicago. But then the next day I went back with a small little studio kit, a small light on a portable cart that we could move around. And we just asked people, what do you want to say? And did a black and white portrait and took people's 25-word response, 25 or less, and simply was there as a public listening tool to reflect what was going on in the community. And so one of the things I did, there was a pastor who operated in a church right there. And I went up and I talked to him first. And I said, hey, here's what I'm trying to do. Do you think this is possible? He said, well, sure. Yeah. He goes, let me do it. And the next day I went back and I showed him his picture and his words. And I showed him some of the other ones that I had done so that he could see that we were trying to be fair. We were trying to listen. We were trying to be supportive. And he said, you know what? I'm not going to talk to any media, but I'll talk to you because I like what you're doing. And then he said, hey, let me introduce you to this person. Let me introduce you to that person. So it is this really slow process of showing up and letting people know that you're trying. Not letting people know that I have the answers, not letting people know that I have the solutions, but letting them know that I'm interested in supporting them in some way. And that's a long process. And I don't know, life is busy. We don't always take the time for that groundwork to build that trust.
You use the word fair in there. I'm interested to hear how you define fair. What's fair?
Did I say that?
You did.
Yeah, it's I'm not sure. There's a huge gulf sometimes between intent and perception. I could come into a community with the intent of doing something, but in the process sort of step on feelings and step on toes, and the perception could be something completely different. somewhere in between there falls the notion of fair. It's not just how I perceive something, but how other people perceive it as well. So I think you have to be sensitive to the larger community sensibilities. And I think fair is making sure that you're taking other people's feelings and experiences into consideration. I don't know that that's a full definition of it, but that's what comes to mind when I think about it.
I love it, and it leaves it open-ended for further interpretation. I'm gonna sit and think about that, John. Several times in the book, you write about sticking your foot in your mouth.
Oh yeah.
What do you do in those moments, especially on these really touch and go topics? How do you navigate the waters there?
One of the reasons why we shy away from some of these difficult conversations, I think, is because we're afraid we're going to mess it up. We're afraid we're going to actually approach it the wrong way or unintentionally offend somebody and get sort of, politically tongue lashed in the process, that we're going to be called to account. And so instead we say nothing at all. Well, that's really not the best solution. It protects us and it holds any of that accountability at bay. But in the process, we also lose out on the ability to connect on a deep level. And so, of course, I try not to be stupid, but it does still happen from time to time. And when it does, we have to own it. We can't run away and pretend it didn't happen. We can't say, "Oh, I hope nobody noticed that," or just walk away and call it done. I think we have to own it, because in that, if we ignore it, whatever wound we just put in play will fester. It will become worse, and it will make it more challenging to work towards healing down the road. And so we have to own it. And that's what I've tried to do. I don't think that this example is in the book, but I'll share it with you and your listeners now. I was at the University of Minnesota. No, I was at the University of Mississippi at the invitation of the diversity office. And we went down there and we gathered stories, and I was getting ready to do a keynote at the end of my stay. My exhibit had been there, did some programming and some classroom work. And we did one of these little studio sessions. And the question we asked was, what is the unique opportunity or challenge of talking about race at this moment in history? There's some history at the University of Mississippi. Mm-hmm. But when I reflect that back to the community, it's in a little video. And I always start by saying a piece of my mind went to, fill in the blank. And we asked this question, fill in the blank, and here's what you said. And then I project the images. Well, the University of Mississippi is sort of historically and commonly referred to as Ole Miss. Every email exchange that you have, the address is this person at olemiss.edu. The football team, Ole Miss. The T-shirts, Ole Miss. So when I put that together, the video said, a piece of my mind went to Ole Miss, and we asked this question, and here's what you said. And the woman who was the head of the diversity program, a Black woman, got visibly uncomfortable. And I said, what just happened? Something just shifted in the room. And if I did or said something, help me understand what. And she explained to me that Ole Miss was not a term that they used, especially in the diversity office, because Ole Miss, the history of that phrase, Ole Miss, was when a slave owner had a Black mistress. That mistress was referred to as Old Miss. And so I had never heard that story before. And I didn't even know what I didn't know. But when I saw that shift in the room, I needed to address it. And then I said, you know what, hang on for she's like, yes, that is what the college uses from time to time. We don't use it. We use the University of Mississippi. And I said, okay, we have 11 minutes before the doors open. Let me go through and re-edit this thing and export it again, because again, language is important. And if your goal is to be there to talk about healing, the last thing I want to do is right out of the gates build some division again. So I think, it happens all the time. And very often it happens because we don't know the full story. And so I think we have to be open to challenging ourselves. We have to be open to other perspectives so that we can do that work of healing.
Man, there are so many questions I want to ask in there. One, I don't even know if there's a great question in here, but the first question that comes to my mind is, I know of so many people who would say, what does it matter? The university uses Ole Miss, they call their football team the Ole Miss Running Rebels or Fighting Rebels or whatever they call them. Why does it matter what I say? It doesn't mean that anymore. To that person, to that woman, it obviously meant a lot, so much so that you physically felt her mood shift. How do we become more aware of those moments?
Well, we have to pay attention. We have to ask better questions. We have to be willing to challenge our own expectations. We have to be a little bit humble. I mean, I think if there was somebody I cared about deeply, if there was somebody in my family who came up to me and said, this thing, whatever it is, bothers me, for me to respond by saying, oh, come on, get over it. It shouldn't bother you. That is deeply insensitive and hurtful. Whether I think it should bother them or not is absolutely not the question. Acknowledging that it does is human. And then being willing to say, okay, you know what? I don't want to cause you pain. It seems like a really reasonable response. If it's that simple, changing my language so that I don't inflict pain upon you, it's kind of a no-brainer in my book.
What you're describing, John, is emotional maturity and emotional intelligence. Do you think that can be learned and taught?
I think everything can be learned and taught. I also think everything needs to be practiced. I mean, if it's worth doing, it's probably worth doing well. If it's worth doing well, we have to exercise those muscles in order to do it. And so my friend Joe Davis, who's a spoken word artist in Minneapolis, he says we do well what we do often. And so, if we're going to have these difficult, and I suppose I'm a case study in this because I didn't come into this project and this work having any secret answer, and I didn't have any, magnificent revelation. I came in curious, and, the first time you have these difficult conversations, it's difficult. It's hard, it's awkward. You're not going to do it very well. And then you do it again, and you get a little bit better, and you do it 40 times and you get some proficiency, and you do it a couple hundred times and it starts becoming natural. But for us to enter into a challenging conversation and finish it and say, oh, that was hard, I don't ever want to do that again, that never gives us the opportunity to build the skills, to build the technique around doing it well. So we've given up before we've ever sort of had any sort of success. And so my hope is that this process and this book and this message can encourage people to practice those skills, to have a little grace with ourselves and with others when we get it wrong, so that we can get better at it and get it right. We're not there yet.
Yeah, my goodness. What you just said reminds me of a point in the book where you ask the question, what tragic behavior are we justifying or defending today? And I'm paraphrasing here, that we'll look back on and think like, oh my gosh, why were we doing that? For you, John, what were those tragic behaviors that have been shown a light on in yourself?
In myself?
Yeah.
I think I can fairly say that when I started this process, I was an activist in the worst sense of the word, which is to say that there were two kinds of people in the world, the ones who thought like me and the idiots. Uh, I think I was pretty self-righteous in my methodology and my view of the world. And the tragic mistake that I was making was simplifying my opponent. It was making a caricature out of anybody who disagreed with me. And what I have learned through the process is a willingness to see the complexity and recognize the nuance, not only around the issues of the day, but also the people who may understand those issues in different ways than I do. And so that willingness to open up to the complexity and see the full humanity of people, I think, is a skill that has helped me avert the tragic error I had been previously making in my life.
Is there one of your interviews, one of your subjects that you spoke with who best exemplified that you came away from that conversation thinking, I saw this all wrong?
Well, a little bit of that happens in every interview.
Yeah.
Really. I mean, there's some of that present all the time. But really, I mean, the example that I write about in the book is Mark Williams, who was an executive with an oil company. And at the time that I interviewed him, we were slowly or maybe quickly going broke. The recession, like I said, had hit my business really hard. And we had this beautiful 4-door pickup truck with an enormous monthly payment, as well as a huge appetite for gas. And we couldn't afford it anymore. So we sold it, bought this junky old Honda Civic with 140,000 miles on it. This was a humbling day for me, but it allowed us to crawl out from some economic pressure and some debt. But right about then, I had the chance to interview this oil company executive. And so I went into the interview with a huge chip on my shoulder. I'm like, man, this guy, they were making record profits every single quarter, new record profits. And gas was almost $5 a gallon. And he was making money hand over fist off of people like me. And I had a pretty clear idea of what an oil company executive was, and it wasn't positive. And I'm not saying that Mark Williams and I agreed on every bit of policy or every bit of understanding, but in the conversation, he very quickly acknowledged that global warming, was a result of combusting fossil fuels, and we had to come up with a global solution to move in a different direction. And in my mind, I had set up the dichotomy of environmentalist equals good and oil company guy equals bad. And in that conversation, I started to see more complexity than that. And in the process, I had to come face to face with my own bias, and I think he early on really exemplified that stumbling block that I had to overcome in the process.
You've mentioned several times, we didn't agree on everything. That, and then you just said that stumbling block. That seems to be a stumbling block for people, that I'm going to go into a conversation and either we have to agree on everything or we don't. How do we get across that? Like, what are the outcomes if it's not agreement?
That's a good question. And people have asked me sort of in the Q&A section after I do a talk about my exhibit or any of these things, they're like, well, but have you ever really changed anybody's mind on any of these issues? And my response has become, I'm not sure that's the goal. The goal is not to change somebody's mind. The goal is not to get them to think like me. The goal is to see some of their humanity. The goal is to realize that they're not the devil, and hopefully they will come to the conclusion that I'm not the devil, and so the goal is not to make sure we land on the same page for every policy issue that is available to us as a nation. The goal is to enhance the process and invest that process with respect, the pursuit of the common good, and finding a common framework that can move us all forward together. So yeah, I think this is a long answer to your very concise question, but the goal. A smart guy said recently, and I wish I could remember his name right now, but I heard him say that we should expect and accept non-resolution. So start the conversation there. I expect we're probably going to get to the end of this and we're not going to agree. I also accept it. But there can be some new understandings that happen if we navigate the conversation well.
I love that. Love that. Save those of us listening right now, packing up our cars with photography equipment and sitting down for 4 hours and interviewing people. How do we apply the lessons that you've learned in all of your interviews into our daily lives? Like, if you can distill it down, what would you say people can do right now to learn the lessons that you have built up and learned over the course of all these interviews and all these miles traveled?
3 easy steps to saving the world. Is that what we're going for?
Yes. I need the checklist, John.
No, it's funny because as an artist, I resisted that for a long time. I'm like, no, just all of it. It's generally useful. We should do that. I realize that's not very helpful. So yeah, I have challenged myself to articulate this better. And I think what it comes down to for me are 3 things. The first is a willingness to listen deeply, right? I don't care if you're driving across the country or if you're going, right next door. We can cultivate that ability to listen deeply. And so we will very often listen to respond or refute or correct, coerce, or convince somebody else. But I find the process of listening an interesting tool to understand better. So if we can engage in these conversations with the goal of not telling people what we think is right, but inviting them to share their understanding of the world, well, then we're listening deeply and we can hope to learn some new things. The second thing, and we talked about this a little bit, is a willingness to challenge our own expectations, to challenge our biases, to be willing to reconsider some potential truths. And so listen deeply, challenge our own expectations, and just continue to show up. None of this work of healing, of bridging divides, of building relationship, of enhancing communities, of moving towards a more perfect union, none of that is going to happen by next week, Tuesday. It's certainly not going to happen at the end of the next conversation. It probably is not going to happen before you and I leave this earth. But by showing up continually, investing ourselves in that practice and that effort, I think it will move the needle in the right direction. It will bend the moral arc of the universe that Dr. King talks about, and we can have made progress. We're not going to solve it all, but to recap for you, to recap for myself, to listen deeply, to challenge our own expectations, and to continue to show up. And we can do that with the people that live in our house. We can do it with the people that live on our street, and we can do it with the people that we come across on a day-to-day basis.
Man, I asked for a checklist and I got it. I did not expect that.
Yeah, again, these are things that I continue to explore because people press me on it. Yeah. And they ask the follow-up question, they ask the clarifying question, so that then I have to consider a response. And that's a worthy exercise. That's an enviable task. And I don't think we do enough of that sort of self-reflection as we go through our day-to-day lives.
Well, how's this for reflection? I highlighted one of the passages in the book where you told your dad, I hope to have a job someday where I get paid to travel and explore the world. What does that mean to you now?
Yeah, my dad is no longer with us. And so it's not fair to say I told you so. That's not the right approach. He would, if I said that to him with a wink, he would appreciate that. But I think when I used to say that to him, his response would be, well, that's not the real world, John. That's not the way the world works. And my young brain said, but what if it could be? I always wanted to challenge, again, those expectations. I always wanted to aim high. My dad came from a really sort of economically conservative background, and he understood you got a job, you worked your job, and it wasn't always fun, but they gave you a paycheck at the end of the day. I had a more whimsical aspirational understanding of vocation. And I thought, well, why couldn't it be something I'm in love with? Why couldn't it be something that I'm dreaming about? And it turns out it can. I mean, it's kind of what is happening in our lives right now for my wife and I. And so I don't begrudge him having that more conservative approach to things. And in fact, I think it's fair to say that because he challenged me, that it made me commit to finding a way to make it possible. Not in a, yeah, I told you so sort of way, but in aspirational. You know what? Maybe people haven't done this regularly, but I think it's entirely possible. And so I think right there in that exchange, you maybe found a microcosm of how I operate in the bigger realm for this project overall. Why couldn't we find a way to bridge these divides? Why couldn't we find a way through some of these thorniest issues? And in fact, when I do these interviews and meet people, I constantly find folks who are demonstrating creative solutions to some of our most challenging issues. And that gives me hope.
You mentioned that you are regularly asked questions that cause you to have to ruminate on these things, but I'm interested. If you've heard my episodes, you know the question's coming. What's a question that you wish you were asked more?
Yeah, I knew that it was coming, but I didn't craft the perfect answer. Give me a moment to gather my thoughts. A question I wish I was asked more is a question that I ask people very often, which is, I think there are books by this title, but what do you wish you had learned earlier in life? What do you understand now that was a vast mystery a decade ago? And I think for me, it's the understanding that we don't need to have all of the answers. We don't have to have our entire course plotted. Had I often describe a piece of my mind as walking down a foggy path, and you can see about 2 steps ahead of you, but when you walk those 2 steps, the fog lifts a little bit and you can see 2 more. And we made the commitment, and when I say we, I mean my wife Karen and I, sort of this family conversation we always try to have, made the commitment early on that if we could see a couple of steps down the path, that we'd keep on walking. And I think the mistake we make often in life is that we have to have the whole path charted out. We say, boy, as soon as I have this whole journey figured out, I'm going to take the first step. As soon as I understand what my final destination is, I'm going to start moving. But my premise is that you should just start moving now. And you can figure out the rest as you're going forward. In fact, maybe you're not even going to be able to see much further down that path until you start moving on it. So I wish that I had figured that out sooner in life. And I wish that people would ask me that question more often.
Well, I'm glad you had the chance to answer it right here. That was a great answer.
I am too. Thank you.
It strikes me, the question that comes up is, you were talking about, going down the path and being assured of the destination. What about the parallel to that, which is always feeling like we need to have the right, in air quotes, opinion? What does it mean to be free of those? I got to assume a lot of your opinions have been challenged over the years that you've been doing these interviews.
Oh, yeah.
What does it mean to be free from feeling like you have to have an opinion about everything?
Yeah, it's interesting because I do have opinions about most everything, but I don't feel compelled to make someone else think that same thing. I have to, I am not a student of Eastern traditions or meditation or Buddhism, but that process of letting go of the need to control is super freeing. I'm from the Christian tradition, and I'm still a person rooted in faith. And when my kids were little, if I had an international travel job, I would sit down on the airplane, and my first task was going to be to go through the checklist of praying all the right things. Oh, let the mechanics of this plane be sound. Let this pilot be well skilled. Let this, let the weather be right. And there was a lot of pressure to try to remember all of the things to make sure that I was safe. At some point in my life, I didn't change that faith, but I changed my approach to it. And I would just sit down on the plane and I would say, here I am, do what you're going to do with me. And that was a freeing experience as well. And I think in so many of these contentious conversations, I can let go of that need to control everything. And I can just try to learn in the process. And that's a game changer.
100%, no doubt. Love that, John. The project is A Piece of My Mind. The book is Portraits of Peace, Searching for Hope in a Divided America. How can people connect with you, get the book, follow along with your work, John? How can people reach out and follow along?
Yeah, our website is apieceofmymind.net. You could also type in the acronym APOMM.net. That's going to feed you links to all of our social media on Instagram and Facebook and Twitter. And yeah, the book, Portraits of Peace, it's available everywhere you love to buy books. It comes out September 21st, the International Day of Peace. It's available for pre-order now.
John, you've done an amazing thing with your project. You've written a fantastically beautiful book. Thank you so much for your time today. I appreciate it, sir.
It's really good to talk with you, Michael. Thanks for the opportunity.
I cannot encourage you enough to go buy John's book, A Piece of My Mind. It's absolutely fantastic. The link is in the show notes. Support him and his mission to help us find more peace in our lives. So many thanks to John for joining me on the show this week and sharing his amazing story. Please do me and John a huge favor and share this episode with someone you know who might also find some value in listening to today's conversation. Share this episode with your network. Help spread the good word about peace and about the importance of asking more questions to help us find common ground. And if you like the conversations with the amazing guests like John that I have on each week, subscribe to the show and you'll never miss an episode. And please, also, if you have it in your heart, go and leave a rating and review of The Follow-Up Question on Apple Podcast and let others publicly know what you think about The Follow-Up Question. If you ever want to get in touch with me, you can always email me at michael@thefollowupquestion.com or go to thefollowupquestion.com and reach out there. I'll catch you on the next episode of The Follow-Up Question, and until then, keep asking questions.